It was a Tuesday morning in Havenwood, Pennsylvania, a town nestled comfortably in the gentle embrace of rolling green hills, a place where life ambled along at its own unhurried pace. For Henry Wallace, a retired history professor in his late 60s, the morning began like countless others. The rich, invigorating scent of dark roast coffee, a daily ritual, was already beginning to perfume the air in his small, book-filled cottage, a testament to a life of quiet routine and cherished, simple pleasures. He had no inkling, of course, that this particular Tuesday, the ordinary fabric of his existence was about to be ripped apart, and his very life would come to depend on the astonishing actions of his most loyal and steadfast companion, a spirited ginger tabby cat named Leo, and a 911 call that would soon become the stuff of Havenwood legend. Henry Wallace was a man who found solace in the predictable cadences of small-town life. His days were measured not by clocks and calendars, but by the turning of pages in well-worn history tomes, the soothing strains of classical music drifting from his old record player, and the comforting, constant presence of Leo, his adopted feline friend. Henry had always been a man of books and quiet contemplation, rather than boisterous company. His beloved wife, Eleanor, had passed away several years prior, leaving a profound silence in the house that even the wisest books and most adventurous narratives couldn't quite fill. It was his physician, a pragmatic, kind-eyed man, who had first suggested a pet during a routine checkup. "Henry," his doctor had said, his voice gentle but firm, "your blood pressure is still a significant concern. The medication helps, certainly, but stress and loneliness are powerful adversaries. Have you ever considered a companion animal? Something to focus on, to care for. It could do wonders for the spirit, and often for the body too." Henry had been skeptical, to say the least. A pet? At his age? It seemed like an awful lot of fuss, an unwelcome disruption to his carefully curated solitude. But the loneliness, especially during the long, quiet evenings when the shadows stretched and the old house creaked, was a tangible presence, a heavy cloak he couldn't shrug off. So, one crisp autumn afternoon, feeling a mixture of apprehension and a faint flicker of hope, he found himself at the Havenwood Animal Shelter. The shelter was a place of organized chaos, a cacophony of hopeful barks and pleading meows, a symphony of creatures great and small, all waiting patiently for a second chance at a loving home. He hadn't gone looking for anything in particular, perhaps a quiet older cat, one that wouldn't demand too much energy or attention, something to simply share the silence with. And then he saw him. Not a quiet, older cat, but a small, vibrant ginger kitten, barely 6 months old, with eyes like polished amber, shining with an almost preternatural intelligence, and a ridiculously fluffy, tufted tail that seemed to have a life of its own. The kitten was batting playfully at a mote-filled sunbeam that slanted through the window, a tiny, fearless explorer in a world of metal cages and unfamiliar scents. The shelter volunteer, a kind woman with a warm smile, noticed Henry's gaze. "That's Leo," she said softly. "He's a real live wire, absolutely full of personality. He was found abandoned near the old lumber mill. Poor thing, but he's a trusting little soul, remarkably resilient." Henry felt an unexpected, undeniable pull. There was an irrepressible spark in the kitten, a zest for life, a joyful abandon that Henry found himself not only admiring but also, in a quiet way, envying. He, who had become so accustomed to caution and reserve, was drawn to this small creature's unbridled enthusiasm. He adopted Leo that very day, leaving the shelter armed with a sturdy pet carrier, a bag of premium kitten food, and a surprising, almost boyish sense of anticipation that he hadn't felt in years. Life with Leo was an adjustment, certainly, but a profoundly welcome one. The oppressive silence that had once blanketed the cottage was joyfully replaced by the soft, stealthy padding of tiny paws on wooden floors, the occasional, imperious meow demanding breakfast at an ungodly hour, and the deep, contented purr of a warm, furry body curled up on his lap as he delved into the annals of history. Leo was, as the shelter volunteer had accurately predicted, a true livewire. He waged epic, imaginary battles against dust bunnies under the sofa, scaled the living room curtains with an alarming, gravity-defying agility, a habit Henry gently but firmly discouraged with varying degrees of success, and greeted every single morning with an enthusiastic, sandpaper-tongued lick and a firm headbutt against Henry's chin. He was also, Henry soon discovered, incredibly intuitive. On days when Henry felt a bit low, when the ghosts of memory pressed too heavily, or when his old joints ached with a particular vengeance, Leo would be extra affectionate. He would stay close, his purrs a low, rumbling thrum of comfort, a constant, warm presence that eased the sharp edges of solitude. He seemed to possess an uncanny ability to sense Henry's moods, offering silent companionship when it was needed most. Henry's hypertension, however, remained a constant, lurking worry in the background of his otherwise peaceful existence. He took his prescribed medication with unwavering diligence, watched his diet meticulously, and consciously tried to maintain a calm, stress-free demeanor. But the fear of a sudden, incapacitating crisis was always there, a cold knot at the back of his mind. He lived alone, after all, and his nearest neighbor was a good quarter of a mile down a winding country road. If something serious happened, who would know? Who would come? It was this persistent thought, this nagging, underlying anxiety, that sparked a peculiar, almost whimsical idea. He'd read an article once, many years ago, tucked away in some forgotten magazine, about a dog that had supposedly called for help for its owner. He dismissed it as sensationalized nonsense at the time, a flight of journalistic fancy. But now, looking at Leo, who seemed to understand so much more than a mere animal logically should, who watched him with those knowing, amber eyes, a fanciful notion began to take root in his mind. What if? Just what if? The telephone in Henry's living room was an older landline model, a sturdy, cream-colored unit with large, clearly marked buttons, a relic from a pre-smartphone era, but reliable. The 9, 1, and 1 buttons were prominent, easily distinguishable. One quiet afternoon, with Leo perched on the arm of his reading chair, watching him with that characteristic, intense feline curiosity, Henry picked up the receiver, listened to the dial tone for a moment, then carefully placed it back down. He then gently, ever so gently, took one of Leo's soft front paws in his hand and tapped it lightly against the 9 button, then the 1, then the other 1. "See, Leo," he'd said, feeling a flush of foolishness creep up his neck. 9, 1, 1. That's for help. That's if Daddy's ever really, really sick and can't get to the phone himself. Leo, of course, had merely blinked slowly, his gaze unwavering, then attempted to playfully bite Henry's finger, clearly interpreting this new interaction as some sort of delightful, albeit strange, game. Henry, undeterred by the cat's apparent lack of comprehension, tried it a few more times over the subsequent weeks. He tapped the numbers methodically, saying them aloud in a clear, calm voice. 9, 1, 1. Help! He even went so far as to place a small, bright red sticker next to the 9 button on the phone's keypad, hoping that the splash of vivid color might somehow draw the cat's attention to that specific key. Tommy, no, Leo, would sometimes bat idly at the phone, especially if Henry dangled a feather toy teasingly near it, his movements quick and agile. But there was never any real indication that he understood the profound gravity of those 3 numbers or the abstract concept of an emergency. Mostly, Leo seemed more interested in the fascinatingly curly cord of the receiver, which he viewed as an excellent chew toy, or the comforting warmth of the telephone unit after it had been used for a long call. Henry eventually gave up his little experiment, chuckling softly at his own fancifulness. Well, it was worth a try, old boy, he'd told Leo, scratching him behind the ears in that spot that always made him purr uncontrollably. You're a clever cat. A very clever cat indeed, but perhaps not that clever. He never seriously, not for a moment, believed that Leo had learned anything beyond associating the telephone with his owner's strange, repetitive tapping behavior and a potential new game. Life settled back into its comfortable, familiar routine. The vibrant colors of autumn gave way to the hushed white blanket of a Pennsylvania winter, and then, eventually, the welcome thaw of spring arrived, painting Havenwood in fresh, hopeful greens and a riot of vibrant blooms. Leo grew from a lanky, energetic kitten into a sleek, handsome adult cat, his ginger fur like burnished copper in the sunlight that streamed generously through the cottage windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The Tuesday of the incident began, as all Tuesdays did, with the promise of unremarkable peace. Henry woke at his usual 7 o'clock, the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee soon wafting invitingly through the small house. Leo was already there, a furry orange shadow weaving intricate figure eights between his ankles, a purring, insistent alarm clock demanding his breakfast with a series of eloquent meows and impatient tail flicks. Henry felt a little more tired than usual that morning, a dull, persistent ache throbbing behind his eyes. He chalked it up to a restless night. Perhaps he'd overdone it in the garden the previous day, wrestling with some particularly stubborn weeds. He ate his customary toast and marmalade, scanned the headlines in the Havenwood Gazette, and dutifully took his blood pressure medication. Leo, having demolished his own fish-flavored breakfast with gusto, was now perched regally on the wide windowsill, watching the sparrows and finches at the bird feeder with the unwavering, intense focus of a seasoned hunter. Around mid-morning, after finishing his coffee and the crossword puzzle, Henry decided to tackle some light chores. He was in the living room, carefully dusting the tall bookshelves, a task he usually enjoyed, surrounded by his old, familiar friends in print. Suddenly, without any warning, a profound wave of dizziness washed over him, so intense and disorienting that the room seemed to tilt and sway violently, like the deck of a ship in a storm. He instinctively gripped the edge of a sturdy oak shelf to steady himself, his knuckles white. His heart began to pound erratically, a frantic, wild drum against his ribs. A sharp, searing pain shot through his chest, radiating with cruel intensity down his left arm and into his jaw. He knew these signs. Oh, he knew them all too well from the grim pamphlets his doctor had given him, the ones he kept tucked away in a drawer, hoping he'd never need to refer to them. This wasn't just a dizzy spell. This was serious. This was the crisis he had always feared. Leo, he gasped, his voice barely a choked whisper, the sound swallowed by the sudden roaring in his ears. He needed to get to the phone. It was on the small antique table across the room, perhaps 15 feet away. In that moment, it might as well have been a mile. His legs felt like lead, heavy and unresponsive, his vision starting to blur and tunnel at the edges. He took one agonizing step, then another, his hand outstretched, trembling, towards the telephone. The crushing pain in his chest intensified, squeezing the air from his lungs, and a cold, clammy sweat broke out on his forehead and upper lip. He stumbled, his knees buckling beneath him as if they were made of string, and crashed heavily to the polished wooden floor. The impact jarred him violently, knocking the remaining breath from his lungs. He lay there, helpless, gasping for air, the room swimming and spinning around him. He tried to push himself up, to somehow crawl towards salvation, but his limbs wouldn't obey his desperate commands. Panic, cold and sharp as shattered glass, clawed at him. He was alone, utterly helpless. The phone, his only lifeline, was still tantalizingly out of reach. He could see it, its cream-colored plastic shell a distant beacon of hope he simply couldn't reach. His vision tunneled further, the world dimming to a narrow slit. The last thing he saw clearly before a suffocating gray fog began to envelop his consciousness was a fleeting flash of orange fur. Now, Leo had been dozing peacefully in a warm patch of sunlight by the window, dreaming of chasing butterflies in endless summer fields, when a sudden, jarring thud startled him awake. He bolted upright in an instant, ears swiveling like radar dishes, tail puffed to twice its normal size. He saw Henry on the floor, unnervingly still, frighteningly quiet. Cats are creatures of habit and routine, and this abrupt deviation was profoundly disturbing, not part of Henry's established, predictable pattern of behavior. Leo approached cautiously, his natural feline curiosity warring with a primal, instinctual sense of unease. He nudged Henry's unresponsive hand with his head, a soft, questioning meow escaping him, a sound tinged with anxiety. There was no response, only a shallow, ragged breath from the man who was his entire world, his provider of food, warmth, and gentle, loving scratches. Leo began to pace, his movements agitated, his small body taut with distress. He circled Henry, meowing louder now, a distressed, insistent, almost mournful sound that echoed in the suddenly silent cottage. He licked Henry's pale face, trying desperately to rouse him, to elicit some familiar sign of life, but Henry remained unresponsive, his eyes closed, his face ashen. The cat's small heart must have been pounding in his furry chest. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. His human, his companion, was in dire distress. What happened next is, and will likely always remain, a matter of some conjecture, a narrative pieced together later from circumstantial evidence, logical deduction, and a healthy, generous dose of wonder. Leo, in his growing agitation and distress, moved erratically from Henry's still form to the telephone table and back again, a small, furry pendulum of anxiety. He jumped nimbly onto the low table where the old-fashioned telephone sat. Perhaps it was the bright red sticker next to the 9 button, the one Henry had placed there all those months ago, a small, vibrant splash of color in an otherwise muted, familiar environment. Perhaps it was a faint, lingering, half-formed memory of Henry's gentle finger, or indeed his own soft paw, tapping those specific buttons in that particular sequence. Or perhaps, in the mysterious, often underestimated way of animals whose senses and instincts are far keener and more attuned than humans often credit, he simply understood, on some deep, intuitive level, that this strange plastic device was important, a tool his human used to communicate with the unseen world outside the cottage walls, a conduit for help. He pawed at the phone, his movements becoming more frantic. Once, twice, his sharp little claws might have skittered uselessly across the smooth plastic surface of the buttons. He nudged it forcefully with his head. Then, somehow, whether with a desperate, flailing swat of his paw or a more deliberate, focused press, his paw landed squarely on the 9. And then again, miraculously, on the 1, and by some incredible stroke of fortune or instinct, a third time on the final 1. The connection was made. A silent alarm was sent out into the ether. At the Havenwood County Emergency Dispatch Center, dispatcher Sarah Bellwether, a veteran of nearly 20 years on the demanding job, was nearing the end of her long morning shift. It had been a relatively quiet morning thus far. A minor fender bender on Main Street, a couple of quickly resolved false alarms from faulty smoke detectors. Suddenly, a new call lit up her console, an urgent blinking light demanding attention. She clicked to answer, her voice calm, professional, and reassuring, a practice cadence honed by years of handling crises. 911. What is your emergency? Silence. Utter, complete silence. Hello, this is 911. Is anyone there? Sarah repeated, her voice a little louder this time, a touch more insistent. Still, only dead air greeted her. No voice, no struggle, not even the sound of heavy breathing or a muffled cry. Just an open line, an eerie, unnerving void. Silent calls were not entirely uncommon. Accidental pocket dials from cell phones, curious children playing with unsecured landlines. But protocol was clear, and her instincts were sharp. If you can't speak, tap the phone or make some kind of noise so I know you're there, she continued, her training kicking in, her senses on high alert. Nothing, but the line remained stubbornly open. Sarah's brow furrowed in concern. Something felt distinctly off about this one, a prickle of unease that she couldn't quite shake. She signaled silently to her supervisor, a seasoned pro who came over to her station. Silent call, open line, no response to voice prompts. She reported quietly, her voice low and urgent. They listened together intently for another 30 seconds, the silence stretching, taut, and unsettling. Her supervisor nodded, his expression serious. Okay, standard procedure. Try an immediate callback. If there's no answer, dispatch a unit to check it out. What's the address on the system? Sarah read the address that had automatically populated on her screen. Henry Wallace, 121, Willow Creek Lane. She disconnected the silent call and immediately, without hesitation, dialed the number back. It rang, and rang, and rang, the sound echoing unanswered in the dispatch center. No answer. No voicemail picked up. No answer on the callback, Sarah said to her supervisor, her unease growing into a genuine concern. I'm dispatching a wellness check. She keyed in the necessary details with swift efficiency, sending the critical information to the patrol units currently on duty in that sector. Possible person down, unresponsive. Officers Miller and Diaz were patrolling the quieter, more rural west side of Havenwood in their cruiser when the call came through their radio. Officer Miller, a burly, experienced officer with a kind face and nearly 2 decades on the force, acknowledged the dispatch with a calm 10-4. Officer Diaz, younger, sharper, and in her 3rd year of service, quickly pulled up the address on the car's GPS. Willow Creek Lane? That's out past the old Henderson farm, pretty isolated out there, she commented, briefly flipping on the siren as they turned onto the main road leading out of town, then switching to just the flashing emergency lights as they neared the more residential, albeit sparsely populated, area. The drive to 121, Willow Creek Lane, took them approximately 10 minutes, winding through scenic but remote country roads. They pulled up to a charming, if slightly weathered, clapboard cottage set back from the quiet lane, surrounded by a meticulously well-tended garden, now vibrant with early summer blooms. A soft light was on in what looked like the living room window. There were no sounds of a disturbance, no obvious signs of forced entry. Everything looked utterly peaceful, almost idyllic, a picture of rural tranquility. Doesn't look like much is happening here, Miller observed, unbuckling his seatbelt, his voice thoughtful. But silent 911 calls from landlines, especially with no callback answer from a place this remote, you gotta take them seriously. Could be anything from a faulty phone line to someone genuinely in trouble and unable to speak or move. They approached the front door, their footsteps crunching softly on the gravel path. Havenwood Police, Miller called out, his voice clear and authoritative, knocking firmly on the wooden door. Mr. Wallace? Is everything all right in there? Silence. Only the distant, cheerful chirping of birds in the surrounding trees answered them. They exchanged a knowing, concerned glance. Diaz reached out and tried the doorknob. It turned easily in her hand, unlocked. This was unusual and immediately raised a red flag. Most people, especially those living alone in more remote, isolated areas, kept their doors securely locked. Havenwood Police were coming in, Miller announced loudly, pushing the door open slowly and cautiously. Diaz had her hand resting near her service weapon, standard procedure when entering an unknown, potentially hazardous situation. The scene that greeted them was startling and deeply concerning. The first thing they saw was an elderly man, presumably Henry Wallace, lying motionless on the floor near a fallen stack of books beside a bookshelf. He was pale, his breathing shallow and labored. He looked to be in serious medical distress. The second thing they saw, almost simultaneously, and which caused them both to do an involuntary double-take, was a ginger tabby cat. The cat was sitting bolt upright, right beside the telephone on a low-end table, looking directly at them with wide, unblinking, intelligent amber eyes. It let out a small, almost polite, questioning meow as they entered. Officer Diaz immediately rushed to Henry's side, her training kicking in. She knelt, quickly checking for a pulse. He's got a pulse, but it's weak and thready, she called out to Miller, her voice urgent. Looks like a major medical emergency. Call for paramedics, quick. While Diaz administered what first aid she could, carefully trying to make Henry comfortable and ensure his airway was clear, Officer Miller radioed for an ambulance, providing their location and a quick, concise assessment of the critical situation. His gaze, however, kept drifting back to the ginger cat, still sitting calmly, almost regally by the phone. The phone itself was an older push-button model, the receiver resting slightly askew in its cradle, as if it had been hastily or clumsily replaced, not quite settled properly. "Did you see that, Diaz?" Miller said quietly, once the call for paramedics was made and acknowledged. The cat, right by the phone, and it was a silent 911 call. Diaz focused intently on Henry, monitoring his vital signs, grunted in acknowledgement. "Focus on the victim, Miller. Cat can wait." But even she, in her peripheral vision, had registered the profound oddity of it. Paramedics arrived within precious minutes, their sirens wailing as they navigated the narrow lane, shattering the usual tranquility of Willow Creek. They quickly and efficiently assessed Henry, their experienced eyes recognizing the classic signs of a severe hypertensive crisis or possibly a stroke, and immediately began emergency treatment. They skillfully loaded him onto a gurney and rushed him to Havenwood General Hospital, lights flashing and siren clearing the way. As Henry was being carefully wheeled out to the waiting ambulance, Officer Miller lingered for a moment in the quiet living room. He looked at the telephone on the table. He looked at the cat, who was now rubbing affectionately against his leg, purring loudly, a surprisingly resonant sound from such a small creature. It was absurd, utterly, completely absurd, and yet the pieces fit together in a way that was hard to dismiss. "Hey, little guy," Miller said softly, crouching down to scratch Leo behind the ears. Leo leaned into the unexpected touch, his purr intensifying. Did you call us? Did you do that?" The cat just purred louder, blinking slowly, offering no definitive answers, only his warm, furry presence. It was a ridiculous notion, of course. Cats couldn't dial 911, could they? He'd heard stories over the years, urban legends mostly, about exceptionally clever pets performing extraordinary feats. But this? A cat dialing a phone? He walked over to the phone table and examined it more closely. There were no other people in the house. They had checked every room. The windows were all closed and locked from the inside, save for the front door they had found unlocked. There was no sign of any struggle, no forced entry, no indication that anyone else had been there recently. Mr. Wallace was clearly severely incapacitated and had been for some time. The 911 call had definitely originated from this specific landline. The dispatcher had confirmed the address and number, and the cat, Leo, was sitting right next to it when they arrived. It was, however improbable, the only explanation that seemed to fit all the observed facts. Later that day, in a quiet room at Havenwood General, Henry Wallace slowly, groggily regained full consciousness. He was weak, disoriented, his head throbbing, but he was alive. His doctor was there, his expression a mixture of grave concern and immense relief. "Henry, you gave us quite a scare," he said, his voice gentle. "It was a severe hypertensive episode, very nearly a major stroke. You're incredibly lucky the officers got to you when they did. A few more minutes, and—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung heavy in the air. Officer Miller and Officer Diaz came by the hospital the next morning to give statement. Once Henry was stable enough to talk and his memory was clearer. After confirming with the nurse that Henry was feeling up to it, Miller gently broached the subject of the 911 call. "Mr. Wallace, we received a 911 call from your residence yesterday. It was a silent call, no voice on the line. Do you remember making that call before you collapsed?" Henry frowned, his memory of the event still hazy, shrouded in a fog of pain and confusion. I remember feeling absolutely terrible. The pain in my chest, the dizziness. It was overwhelming. I was trying to get to the phone. I remember reaching for it. I think I fell. I don't think I ever actually reached it. A look of sudden distress crossed his pale face. "Oh dear. If I didn't make the call, then who?" Miller hesitated for a moment, feeling a bit foolish himself for even suggesting what he was about to say. "Mr. Wallace, when we arrived at your cottage, your cat, Leo, was sitting right next to the telephone on the end table, and the receiver was slightly off the hook. Henry stared at him, his eyes wide. Then a slow, incredulous, wondrous smile spread across his weary face. He remembered, with a sudden jolt of clarity, the silly training sessions. Tapping Leo's paw on the numbers. 9, 1, 1. Help! The bright red sticker next to the 9. He dismissed it all as a fanciful waste of time, a harmless eccentricity. "Leo," he whispered, his voice raspy. Then he chuckled, a weak, wheezy sound that was nevertheless full of burgeoning amazement. "You're not going to believe this, officer, but I actually tried to teach him to dial 911. Just as a silly game, something to pass the time. I never, ever, not in a million years thought." He looked at Miller, then at Diaz, his eyes wide with a mixture of profound disbelief and dawning, overwhelming wonder. "You think he actually did it? My Leo? My little ginger cat?" Officer Miller carefully described the scene they had found. The unlocked front door. Perhaps Henry had absent-mindedly left it unlatched that morning. Or perhaps, though far less likely, Leo had somehow managed to paw at a lever-style handle if it was low enough on an interior door leading to an unlocked exterior one. Though this was pure speculation, the cat calmly sitting by the phone as if on guard. No one else present in the locked house. "We can't say for certain, Mr. Wallace. There's no paw print evidence on the keypad, so to speak," Miller said with a slight, empathetic smile. But the dispatcher at the 911 center, Sarah Bellwether, confirmed the call definitely came from your landline. "You were clearly incapacitated, and Leo was the only other living being in the house. It's the only explanation that fits all the facts, however extraordinary and unbelievable it seems." Officer Diaz, who had been listening quietly, her arms crossed, added her professional perspective. The dispatcher, Ms. Bellwether, mentioned something interesting. She said the call was completely silent. If a person had made the call, even if they collapsed immediately afterward, you'd often hear something, a gasp, a thud, a moan. The utter silence on an open line is consistent with something just pressing the buttons and then perhaps knocking the receiver off or back on imperfectly without making any human sounds. The story of Leo, the 911 dialing cat, quickly spread like wildfire through the Havenwood Police Department, then to the dispatch center, and eventually, inevitably, into the pages of the local Havenwood Gazette. It was precisely the kind of heartwarming, almost unbelievable tale that people desperately wanted and needed to believe in. Local cat saves owner's life with miraculous 911 call. The headline blared a week later, accompanied by a slightly blurry but endearing photo of Leo looking suitably regal and utterly indifferent to his newfound, sensational fame, a photo supplied by a beaming and incredibly proud Henry Wallace. Henry's recovery was slow but steady. He spent several more days in the hospital under close observation before finally being allowed to return home, armed with new medications, stricter dietary guidelines, and firm instructions for follow-up care. His very first, most urgent request upon returning to the familiar quiet of his cottage on Willow Creek Lane was to see Leo. The ginger cat greeted him at the door with his usual enthusiastic figure eights weaving around his ankles and a series of happy, welcoming chirps and insistent meows. Henry knelt, wincing slightly from the effort, and gathered the small, furry hero into his arms. He held Leo close, burying his face in the soft, warm fur that smelled of sunshine and home. "Oh, Leo," he murmured, his voice thick with unshed tears and overwhelming emotion. "You saved my life, you clever, wonderful, magnificent boy. You truly, truly did." Leo just purred, a deep, rumbling sound of pure contentment, perhaps blissfully oblivious to the true magnitude of his actions, or perhaps, in his own inscrutable feline way, fully aware. He was, after all, just being Leo, but to Henry Wallace, he was infinitely more than just a cat. He was a furry guardian angel, a tiny, unassuming hero in a splendid ginger coat. The little red sticker next to the 9 on the telephone remained a permanent, silent tribute. Henry never tried to train Leo again. There was absolutely no need. He knew, with a profound certainty that settled deep in his bones and warmed his grateful heart, that he had the most extraordinary, most intelligent, most loyal cat in Havenwood, perhaps in all of Pennsylvania, perhaps in the entire world. The bond between them, already strong and deeply cherished, had deepened into something truly profound, a testament to the surprising, powerful connections that can form between man and animal, and the incredible, almost unbelievable ways in which love, instinct, and perhaps a touch of magic can manifest. Life in the little cottage on Willow Creek Lane returned to its peaceful, predictable rhythm, but it was now imbued with a new, tender layer of gratitude and daily wonder. Henry Wallace still enjoyed his beloved books and his classical music, but his greatest, most profound joy was the constant, comforting presence of Leo, the cat who knew how to call for help, the cat who was, and always would be, his hero. And every single time the phone rang, or Henry made a call himself, he couldn't help but glance at Leo with a soft smile and a heart full of love, vividly reminded of that fateful Tuesday morning when the ordinary had spectacularly, miraculously, become extraordinary, all thanks to a little ginger cat and a love that, quite literally, knew how to reach out and save a life. The tale of Leo, the 911 dialing cat of Havenwood, would be told and retold for years to come, a heartwarming, cherished local legend, a reminder that heroes can indeed come in the most unexpected of packages, sometimes small, furry, four-pawed, and purring contentedly and deservedly on your lap.